All right, people are still joining, but we're going to get started with the introductions, and if people come in late, no worries. So, hello everyone, welcome to another Chmura webinar. My name is Avery and I work on Chmura's marketing team. So if you've watched with us before, welcome back. But in case it's your first time, we're going to introduce ourselves. So our speakers today are Chris Chmura. She is Chmura's CEO, founder, and chief economist. She is a national leader on labor market forecasts. She's a blue chip economist. And today she's going to be talking about our COVID-19 forecast, as she's been doing for the past year. Comment if you were on one of our first webinars in March or April 2020. That would be, it's been a while, and we've been glad to journey alongside all of you. And our other speaker is Brian Shelley. He is Chmura's senior strategist for education. And also, since the beginning of the pandemic, he's been talking about what educators can expect from budgets or enrollment, etc. And he's going to give some education forecasts for us today. Oh, I see Clay was there. All right, next slide. So if you're wondering, if it's your first time, you may be wondering, who is Chmura? Why are we talking about labor market data? Chmura provides labor market data and analysis so you can make informed decisions that help your organization grow. We help site selectors, economic developers, educators, workforce professionals, you name it. Everyone needs data. We were founded in 1998 by Christine Chmura, who is one of our speakers. And today we have offices in Richmond, Cleveland, and now in Dallas, Texas. So we're economists, data scientists, statisticians, and business professionals who care about helping your community grow. And so how we do that is one way is our JobsEQ software tools. JobsEQ is the best labor market software tool on the market. And we've actually released 4 new products. We've got JobsEQ Pro, which compiles data down to the census block level. We've also got JobsEQ for education, JobsEQ for workforce, and JobsEQ for economic development. And we've updated the layout of these 4 new products to make them more beautiful, more user-friendly, so you can get the information you need and get back to doing your job of helping your organization and helping people. But we also understand if you don't have the time or resources to dig into that data by yourself, or if you need help creating a strategic plan or analyzing the impact of COVID-19 on your local economy, we have consultants who can perform that analysis for you. We've done dozens of COVID-19 impact studies. And so there's also that part of the services we offer. And whether you're a software client, a consulting client, or if you're not a client yet at all, we are driven by your satisfaction and success. Excellence is really our first priority, both in customer service and in data quality. And so because we believe that everyone deserves accessible economic data, we offer a lot of resources for free. We have these webinars. We have a blog series. We have a podcast. Season 2 is going to be releasing soon. And we also have the weekly economic update. If you've attended these webinars, you've seen, you know that the weekly economic update is written by our economists. It's a great national overview of the economy that's delivered straight to your inbox every weekend. And so usually, now is when I say comment with your email address. But this time, you can sign up yourself. If you're not a subscriber yet, just click on that subscribe button and you just have to enter your email address. I'm also posting the link in the chat. It's super easy. You just put your name and your email address and you'll get your first copy this weekend. So please do that if you're interested in our free, completely free, will always be free, weekly economic update. Finally, before we get started, please type all questions in the chat and we will answer them at the end of the webinar. Everyone who registered for the webinar will get a recording and also the slide deck, and that will be sent either later this afternoon or tomorrow. So now that all those logistics are out of the way, oh, I see Karen says the weekly economic update is great. Thanks, Karen. Oh, and sorry, just some good comments from Jackie. I've been with you, I think, since the beginning and enjoyed the webinars for the entire journey. So thank you all. We will continue producing these webinars as long as you find it useful. So now that all those logistics are out of the way, let's get started with the good stuff. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Avery. So as Avery said, I'll be giving you an overview of the economy and how we're doing through COVID. And those of you who have been with us know that the recession started in February of last year. GDP was deep and quick contraction. And we've also had a rebound. You'll see in the data. GDP is much different than employment. Employment, it varies in terms of how fast we're coming back based on the industry. And I'll show you some data there. And we have some more historical data than we've had in the past. And then finally, we'll talk about herd immunity, because it's not until we get to herd immunity that we'll see the full recovery. And then after that, Brian will talk about the forecast on the education side. So beginning with the national economy, as you all know, most places around the world define a recession as 2 consecutive drops in GDP. That comes out quarterly. But here in the U.S., we have this National Bureau of Economic Research, and within that group, there's a business cycle dating committee who looks at all of the data, monthly data, and determines when a recession starts and ends. And so in gray, and these are 3 of the indicators that they look at. In gray, you see the current recession, the last recession. So in terms of employment dropped, and we lost just about all of the jobs that were created over the past expansion. But we've been seeing employment come back fairly quickly, where we've gained back 50% of the jobs in past in past recoveries. It has taken over 1 year to gain back 50% of the jobs. So at least that's positive. We're continuing to see employment grow, although not as fast as in the first couple of months. And of course, when we get to that herd immunity point, would expect this number to start to rise rapidly again. On the right, we're looking at personal income and personal spending. So consumer spendings on goods and services make up about 70% of GDP. So this number is very important. You see the huge drop off as we went into the phase where we had to social distance, stay at home when possible. And we saw the numbers come back fairly quickly, a lot quicker than most economists thought. We're only down about 4% from a year ago. Income spiked when we first went into the COVID recession, and that's because of the CARES Act and the money that went to households, as well as the increase in unemployment insurance, the amount of money people were getting when they became unemployed. We would expect this to spike in another month or so, as we start to see the latest $1.9 trillion trickle into the economy, or not trickle, it will come in quickly. Industrial production, so manufacturing, output, as well as utilities and mining, dropped off. This is looking at percent change from a year ago, and we're coming back fairly quickly there as well. Down about 3% from a year ago in terms of industrial production. So GDP, broadest indicator of economic activity. Here you see the Great Recession, which was the worst recession that we'd seen since the Great Depression, and it pales in comparison to the deep drop that we saw during the COVID-19 recession. So second quarter numbers down around 30% annualized, and then you see the rebound up in the in the third quarter, and this was the second quarter. So the rebound annualized about 30% as well. And then the fourth quarter, we saw just a little less than 5%. Now, going forward in terms of our forecast, you can see it here ranging from around 4 to 5%. Anytime you see something above 2%, that's considered very strong growth. So we expect the second half of this year to be very strong. That's as we come out of these COVID restrictions, more people have the vaccine, and even into 2022, we expect that year to come in very strong as we're seeing a lot of pent-up demand and spending in the economy. So the recovery is dependent on the vaccine and herd immunity. And again, we've talked about this before, but it bears repeating that it typically takes 5 to 10 years before a vaccine is created. In this case, we've seen it in less than 1 year. And then typically you don't start to manufacture the vaccine until it's been approved by the FDA. But Health and Human Services and Department of Defense had agreements with Moderna and other firms to start to manufacture the vaccines so that it would be available once it was passed by the FDA. And so now at this point, herd immunity is going to bring us back to more normal times. And we'll get to that in just 1 minute. But here we're looking at employment. How quickly will employment come back? And we have 3 scenarios. The way to read this is that we indexed employment to pre-COVID levels. So employment in 2019 Q4 is 100. And then again, we've dropped off on average for all industries. We've lost about 12% of all employment. And here we're looking at actual data through this point. So right now, on average, we're looking at only down about 6% in terms of employment from pre-COVID levels. But that, again, that varies greatly by industry. And so we had 3 scenarios, and it turns out that our most likely scenario is the one that appears will come to pass. In that most likely scenario, we assume that the vaccine is widely distributed in the second quarter of this year. In that case, you'd see employment to pre-COVID levels in the first quarter of 2022. The slow case would be if we have some of the variants that come up and the vaccine don't work as well with the variants. Here we were assuming that the vaccine is not widely distributed until the third quarter of 2022, which means employment wouldn't be back to pre-COVID levels until 2023. And then this fast case, we're almost to the point where absolutely we can say that that is not going to happen. We're almost at the end of the first quarter. If we did see the vaccine widely distributed about the end of the first quarter, we could see pre-COVID employment levels fourth quarter 2021. So now here's that messy chart with all the industries. So here, what we did is we looked at the recovery by industry, not just for these high-level industries, but we broke it down. For example, construction, we looked at residential versus commercial construction, highways and building, and then we summed it up to the higher level to give you a sense of how that industry was performing. So here I've got a line where we've got actual data to the left of this line. The numbers are indexed again to 100 at pre-COVID. So the one that jumps out here at the top is agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting. Employment fell by 5%, and then very quickly it jumped up to more than 5% of what it was pre-COVID, and then a little higher than that, and then we see it flattening out here going forward. The one industry that's been hit the hardest, arts and entertainment, where you can't social distance very easily, and so you see that they lost nearly 50% of all their workers, and then it has been coming back fairly well, but slower than most other industries. The green is accommodation and food services, which again fell sharply, and we saw some increases. It's flattened out a bit, but we expect it to come back sharply again as we start to see people getting their vaccine. On this next chart now, I'm starting to peel away the industries that fell the most so that you can get a sense of how the other industries are faring. So in green now, we're looking at mining and gas extraction, and I would expect that it stayed low here in part because oil prices are low because not as many people are traveling, but then we're going to start to see employment there start to pick up as people travel more and gasoline prices go up. In red, other services, this would include things like dry cleaning, auto repair, spas, religious organizations, and you see the drop off there. And again, that industry coming back. And then when we get to COVID, beyond COVID levels, or I'm sorry, beyond the 100 COVID level that we saw earlier, we continue to see growth, although somewhat slow. This dark blue line is administrative support and waste management, and that would be, waste collection, services to buildings, facility support. And again, you see that dropped off and then starting to come back. On this next slide now, the red line is retail trade. And in this case, here you see actual data, but notice that when we get out into 2022, we never do get back to that 100 line. And that's because some of the jobs that were in retail have gone now to transportation and warehousing. And so when we look at that, you're going to see some stronger growth there, but that's going to be a long-term trend. The expectation is for just a slight decrease in employment over time once we get back to more normal retail operations. Green is real estate, and that sector has been doing fairly well. The dark purple is healthcare. And again, notice when we get to the pre-COVID levels of employment, it continues to grow out into the future because of demographics. Blue is management of companies and enterprises. That's headquarters. It didn't drop as much because many of those people can work from home. And then public administration here, again, notice as we went into the COVID recession, it actually increased a little, then came down. And now it's up a little bit, about 6% higher than COVID levels. And then we see very slow growth going forward. One more chart here on varying by industry. Manufacturing. Here you see manufacturing employment coming back. And then notice when we get to pre-COVID employment levels, it declines. Now this forecast is based on the trends in manufacturing previous to COVID. However, as we've seen, that some manufacturing is coming back to the U.S. because we saw that we had supply chain issues, not only just in the pharmaceutical area and protective equipment, but even things like semiconductors. So this may actually be too negative. We may see manufacturing employment continue to rise once we get to pre-COVID levels. Construction in blue, and of course, residential construction is doing very well right now. We expect employment there to continue past pre-COVID levels. The dark black line is professional, scientific, and technical services. Many of those jobs can be done from home, so the dip was not as great. And green, also finance and insurance, many can be done from home, so the dip was not as great there earlier either. So herd immunity. Typically, we economists will make assumptions in our forecasts based on things like how much we expect the Fed to increase interest rates, when we expect them to raise interest rates, what is the price of gasoline doing, and that type of thing. But now we economists are spending a lot of time learning about healthcare and herd immunity and when we're going to get to a point where we're at herd immunity. So we have a model that actually Alex Doherty, who works with us, has been working on, and we have a blog that you can go and look at your own state, how it's doing. But here in the U.S., notice the new cases, how much they have risen. After Thanksgiving, we saw quite a big pickup, and then after Christmas, there's a little concern that we may see a pickup here after spring break, but that has not materialized yet. And we're not medical people, so we rely on the University of Washington and their forecasts about the infection rates to underpin our model. So here you can see the big pickup. Here you can see it has been declining, and at least in their model, they're not assuming a spike from the spring break period, but they're assuming it will continue to come back down. So in light of that, and again, if you want to go to this link, you could see your state and look at some more detail and background on this model. We're assuming that we need 80% of people to either have the vaccine or to have had the virus before we get to herd immunity. And by the way, in our model, we assume that people who had the virus have immunity for only 6 months. So we've got those people rolling on and rolling off over time. So it's looking like we're going to get to herd immunity somewhere between our most likely and optimistic case. And that would put us there late summer, say around end of July, early August. And then in our pessimistic scenario, you see that we don't get to 80% until October, November. So some of the underlying numbers there, and again, for more detail, go to our blog, but we've had 600 total vaccine purchased from Moderna and Pfizer, 200 additional from Johnson & Johnson. As of the 22nd, so 2 days ago, 82 million Americans received a single dose and 45 million are fully vaccinated, according to CDC. At the beginning of the year, we were administering 1 million doses per day. On average, over the past week, it's been 2.5 million. And many medical individuals were saying that it would be very hard to get to 3 million, and we're almost there. We're assuming 80% is the threshold for herd immunity, although some people have said it could be 70%. And Kaiser Foundation has been doing surveys on how willing are people to get the vaccine, and it continues to go up over time. In February, their last survey, it was at 77%. So what do the different states look like? Here, you're looking at, in green, states that are moving faster toward herd immunity, and in blue, those that are a bit slower. So the top states right now are Alaska in terms of the percent that have been vaccinated, Alaska, New Mexico, and West Virginia. In terms of our optimistic scenario, those states in green are on track to be at herd immunity by July of this year. Those light green by August, and those in light blue by September, dark blue, October 2021. And that's our optimistic scenario. Our most likely scenario, however, similarly, those in green by August, light green by September, blue by October, and dark blue by November. So we're seeing some great progress in the U.S. right now. And another question that people have asked is how much of this work from home is going to stick? And the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, added a question to their household survey regarding that. How have you teleworked in the past 4 weeks due to the pandemic? 26% said yes in July. Notice that dropped off to 21.8% in November. And then when we saw the virus pick up again in terms of infection rates, it increased, more people working from home. And now, latest data, it's down to 23% working from home due to the pandemic and having to social distance. The conference board did a survey of about 2,200 people in January, asked them the question for employees who worked virtually and remotely during the pandemic: does your organizations have plans for how they can return to the office or work site? And 5% said returning will be required for all. A third of them said returning will be required for some, voluntary for others, so a hybrid approach. And then 11% said returning will be voluntary for all, but still we had 44%, or almost half, who were uncertain about their plans for the future. So a lot of uncertainty out there regarding how these work from home policies will stick going forward in the economy. So in terms of COVID-19, clearly this crisis is coming to an end. It's good to see so many people start to get vaccinated. In terms of the national outlook, the virus, COVID-19 recession was sharp and it was short, not sustained in terms of GDP, but clearly on the employment side, it varies greatly by industry depending on how much the people that work within that industry can social distance, and clearly going forward dependent on getting to that herd immunity. So with that, let me stop sharing my screen and hand this over to Brian.
All right, great. Thank you, Chris. I have started sharing my screen. And if somebody could please let me know when they see it.
Brian,
We see the infinite screens.
All right, that's perfect. Then we are ready to go. So let's talk. We're going to talk not only about the forecast for education in the next year, which is better than the year we've just had. We're going to review the year that that just had and talk about really what happened to higher education, and while even though it has been bad, it's maybe not been as bad as people expected. Obviously, the most important thing that we can review is not the financial numbers associated with higher education the past year. It's sort of the toll that it's taken on people, right? And so really interesting findings here, and really sort of sad findings that the Chronicle of Higher Education reported. 76% of students say that their mental health has worsened since the pandemic began. Female faculty members have lost an estimated 90 minutes of time for research each day. And I will tell you, as a former college professor, to lose that much research time really puts a great stress on the career going forward for things like tenure decisions and things like that. And so, not that promotion is the most important thing during a pandemic, but an additional stressor certainly for our faculty. And then this one I really thought was crazy, and maybe the most worrying for the future of higher education, which is that 40% of students lost a job, an internship, or a job offer as a result of the pandemic. In other words, within the last 12 months here. That obviously has great implications for the future of this generation's education, its financial stability, and a lot of different things that we'll talk about throughout this presentation. But focusing now for a minute specifically on higher education institutions rather than students or faculty. Did the recession affect higher education enrollment? There was reason to believe going into this recession that maybe enrollment drop wouldn't be that bad. In every previous recession, college attendance levels actually increased, and it was mostly part-time employment that grew. And that makes a certain amount of sense when you realize that, maybe if you get laid off of a job during a recession, or you get fired from a job or whatever, you want to get involved in education. You go back to school to try to acquire a skill or a certificate that might allow you to get back to the workforce quickly. So what we saw was, for a lot of two-year colleges, you had a lot of students enrolling in the previous recession in things like 6-month certificate programs, year-long programs, or even 2-year degrees. And the community colleges and technical colleges actually saw an increase in their total enrollment as a result of prior recessions. That has not been the case this time. So everybody's fears have been somewhat realized. That enrollment has dropped significantly in some areas. Overall, it probably hasn't been as bad as people predicted, right? So overall, post-secondary enrollments are down 2.5% in the fall of 2020. And we have preliminary numbers for the spring of 2021, which tell us that it's 2.9 enrollments are 2.9% behind what they were in the beginning of spring of 2020, right? So about a 2.5-3% drop. Undergraduate enrollment was the primary driver for this decline, 3.6%. In other words, over 560,000 fewer students have been enrolled in the fall 2020 versus the fall of 2019. Side note, graduate student enrollment is actually up, and is up for the spring semester as well. So that's another piece of decent news, right? Now we're getting into sort of where the hit has been more severe, and it's been more severe at public colleges. which enroll 70% of secondary students, and they've declined by 40% or 4%, or nearly 530,000 students. So the vast majority of the losses that have come in student enrollment have come as a result of drops to public school enrollment. And it's mainly happened at two-year institutions. These are the institutions that are in trouble right now, okay? We have seen sharp declines at public two-year institutions. They've lost over 200,000 students, 21% decrease in their enrollment. You can see it right above that. We've had over a 13% drop in freshman enrollment from last fall, and that's unprecedented, right? So what we have here is not a case of students who already were in college and they take a year off, right? Or they're forced to take a year off. Instead, what we have are a lot of young people delaying college for a year. We hope just delaying, right? We hope this doesn't cause more of them to fall outside of the higher education setting and to abandon their higher education plans altogether. But again, it's the drop in freshman enrollment that is driving the decrease in total enrollment. The drop has been more pronounced for disadvantaged communities. And this is Black, Hispanic, and Native American freshman enrollment is down nearly 30% versus about 20% for all others. So we see some disproportionate impacts here on Black and Brown people. 27.5 fewer fewer Hispanic students enrolled at community college. So in these communities, you're seeing sort of like what we hope, again, is a temporary sea change of much fewer people going on to higher education. And while that's particularly worrying, is that we have seen that research study after study confirms that delays and pauses in enrollment are associated with lower likelihood of earning a degree or a credential. In other words, when you stop going to school, you become less likely to finish school. Now, there are reasons to hope that the dynamic might be different now. That dynamic, again, this is not a recession like any other. There were people who, didn't just stay out of college or a two-year college or a technical school for economic reasons. They stayed out for health reasons, or they stayed out because they knew that the quality of education might be compromised with things like remote learning. I think at this point, we've all seen those pictures of the classrooms that have the plexiglass dividers in there. Just, as a former teacher, that looks absolutely horrifying to me. And the key question, right, the key question remains, for getting these students back on track. How quickly will these students and families get back to work? Now, we expect, with what Chris has told us with herd immunity, we're going to see a surge in both enrollment and first year enrollments in the fall of this semester. The question will be, right, are the jobs that students work at returning quickly? Because those jobs are disproportionately in things like food services. You think about the jobs, those of you who went to college, that you worked to get through. You did things like bartend or wait tables. And those, of course, in the hospitality industry are the jobs that have suffered the most, and the industries that we think will take a little bit longer to bounce back. So that is something to watch. The recovery of the economy in general, and those sectors in particular, will have a big influence on how quickly students get back into school. Now, as far as what schools are facing in terms of a loss of funding, right? The Chronicle of Higher Education estimated that schools are facing a $183 billion in cuts and losses as a result of the coronavirus. You can see here, right, that 85 billion of that is projected from lost revenues, mostly, right, students not coming, therefore not paying tuition. You can see that we're expecting only about 24 billion in COVID-related expenses, and I say only relatively there because the other two categories are much bigger. And then anticipated state funding decreases. The Chronicle of Education projected, and I think this is from about December or so, that there would be an anticipated state funding decrease of a total of $74 billion. Now, when you get in the world of billion of dollars, there are no insignificant losses, right? But there are reasons that we'll talk about in a second to think that it won't be this bad. But still, obviously, this has been a year of financial strain for colleges. Now, the good news is that this strain has not led to a lot of college closing. You know, if you read some of the national newspapers, you know, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, it seems like every 6 months or so they have a story about a college that might close or is threatened to close, and they talk about the dynamics that are sort of working against particularly small colleges right now. And we were really worried going into the COVID recession that that would be the case. I've seen estimates that predicted as many as 1,000 colleges might close, right? To this point, there have only been 10 college closures, 10 college, community college, technical school closures over the past year. And those were mostly schools that were in deep financial trouble prior to the pandemic. In other words, these are schools that we didn't think would make it prior to the pandemic. That's, you know, it's a shame for those 10 colleges. And in most cases, these 10 colleges are not strictly going out of business and the students are shut out the next day. Most of these end up being mergers where schools merge with somebody, another college nearby, sort of consolidate. The one institution gets a little bigger, maybe enjoy some economies of scale and things like that. But it is pretty relatively great news that we've only lost 10 schools in the last year. Where the financial woes have been felt are in a couple places. We've definitely felt them in sort of the program cuts. There was a lot of talk last fall when Stanford eliminated 11 varsity sports programs. And that's just an example. That has happened in a lot of institutions. You know, there are some Big Ten institutions that have done things like, I think Minnesota cut women's track or something like that. I don't have all that information there, but you are seeing a cut in sports programs. And some schools are even getting into department cuts, right? So the University of Vermont will no longer have a classics department, a geology department, or a religion department. Again, these departments were struggling to fill up their classes. There wasn't the student demand for their classes. Those are the types of programs that schools are looking to close right now. But it still represents a loss potentially of jobs, and it represents a lack of options, academic options for students. It's not been a good year for the higher ed workforce at all, right? There's an estimated 650,000 workers in higher education that have lost their job over the last year. And you can see over the past, really over the past 20 years before the pandemic hit, there was uninterrupted job growth in higher education, which is particularly notable given what we know about 2009, 2010, the recession that was happening there. Higher education was still growing. It, like everything else, fell off a cliff very quickly as soon as this COVID recession got going, and it hasn't quite rebounded yet. You can see that even a little more here. So this is job posting data from our RTI analytic in JobsEQ. RTI presents the job postings from over 40,000 job search engines out there. And we deduplicate them. We aggregate them up so that you can look at trends. It's really a neat tool. And if you're a JobsEQ user, it's my favorite analytic that we have. But anyway, job postings are a really good proxy for things like total employment and hiring and stuff like that. And what we have here is we have a graph of the job postings in 2019 versus 2020. So this gray line are the total number of job postings in higher education for 2019. And this blue line is it represents all the job postings in 2020, right? Again, in higher education. So you can see before the pandemic, hiring was going along just about as people thought that it would prior to, relative to the previous year. Jobs were still getting posted at the same rate. Everything was good. Then, of course, March of last year hit, and you can see how quickly schools adjusted their job postings and basically decided we're not going to hire anyone, right? Now, that has, as we've gotten further from that initial March event, started to rebound some. You can see that colleges are starting to hire again, but they still haven't closed that gap in total job postings, let alone if we expected schools to fill the jobs that they had eliminated as a result of COVID, you'd expect these job postings to be much higher in 2020 than they were in 2019. So again, it's if you know anybody who has worked in higher education in the past year, they can probably tell you about people who have lost their jobs close to them because it's been bad, frankly. And the people that are losing their jobs in higher education are generally lower wage jobs. So you can see a tremendous loss, over 24,000 fewer job postings, almost 25,000 fewer job postings in 2020 versus 2019 for secretaries and administrative assistants. You can see that a lot of administrators went away too, and they had higher mean wages. But the other jobs here, office clerks, social and human services assistants, career counselors, guidance counselors, and things like that. These are the people who were not being hired and who were losing their job at the highest rate. And because of the low salaries associated with these positions, these are the people that probably had the lower nest eggs build up to sort of survive something like this. And so things like government assistance from the stimulus and stuff like that have been particularly important to sort of these lower wage workers who have disproportionately lost their job. Now let's start talking about 2021, the next school year, which will look a lot better and will look a lot more positive than this past school year has looked. We're planning for in-person learning in fall 2021. These are just 5 universities or university systems that have announced that they have gone, that they're going to go back to in-person learning starting in fall 2021. There are new coming up each day. I think Temple University in Philadelphia announced that they were going in person yesterday. And so the expectation among most observers of higher education is that almost every school will have some version of in-person learning in fall 2021. And that has tremendous implications for things like enrollment, where we expect if classes are back in session at something close to pre-pandemic, looks something like the pre-pandemic classroom, we expect a lot of students to return to that, and that maybe they took a year off because they didn't want to do virtual learning for a year. So that would be a boost for enrollment, certainly, right? Now let's talk some more about these revenue issues, right? A return to in-person learning does not immediately solve the revenue issues, right? And you can see why when you think about this $85 billion out of that $187 billion I shared earlier. That 85 billion represents only 41% of the total anticipated revenue losses, right? There was still all this money we had to spend on things associated with COVID, things like those plexiglass barriers, things like increased remote learning access, those types of things. And then there's this impact of the $85 billion loss from state funding that is likely to hit next year. Or is it, right? And that's sort of, there have been a lot of doomsday predictions, I think, not just for education, but in education as well. There were a lot of doomsday predictions in March 2020, April 2020, right? And this prediction that the Chronicle of Higher Education I do believe has some element of that thinking in there, and that the financial picture isn't quite as bad as this graphic would have you believe. All right. Thus far, estimates of state funding budget shortfalls have been wildly overstated all the way down the line, right? Due to the last stimulus, right, in large part due to that, the last stimulus, federal funds took the place of any state funding losses to higher education, so that state funding of higher education last year was actually flat. In other words, the funding that came from federal and state sources was almost exactly the same as it was in the what would that be, 2019-2020 school year or fiscal year 20. And so this estimate of $74 billion lost from state funding, that seems high, right? Especially when you factor in the new stimulus, right? The new stimulus gives nearly $40 billion to higher education. Schools must use 50% of the received funds on financial aid. So in other words, let's get students back into schools, maybe in particular those students that have new financial need as a result of this recession. Let's ramp up our financial aid so that we can get them back on campus. There's also a lot of specific support for schools with endowments of less than $1 million. This is a tremendous boost to places like historically Black colleges and universities, places like community colleges, technical schools, any public school, and that's important to note, right? Public, not private institutions, public-private doesn't matter. Profit for not for profit matter, right? So if you are a nonprofit educational institution, you are eligible for this $40 billion. If you are a for-profit provider, you are not eligible for that. But anyway, this specific support to schools with less money, important for technical colleges, important for HBCUs, important for a lot of colleges that maybe had less revenue to weather this storm. The federal government is trying to keep them on their feet. And as a result of sort of this stimulus and the general improving financial picture, just yesterday, Moody's raised its outlook for higher education from negative to stable. And that has tremendous influence on the credit that schools have and what they can do with that credit. And so that's another boost for their financial sales. And finally, one other piece of news that is not financial, but I think counts as good news for higher education. Higher education has proven it can adapt quickly during this pandemic, right? There's the image of sort of higher education as just another bureaucracy. And indeed, these schools, you take a school like Michigan, University of Michigan, that has probably 100,000 students on its campus at any given time. They are, in fact, huge bureaucracies, right? And we all have this stereotype that bureaucracies can't adapt, that they're always years behind the changes that we need. But higher education has kind of bucked that trend, right? They moved everybody to online learning at the beginning, or some blend of hybrid learning by the fall of 2020. And it is tremendous. It shows tremendous adaptability. If you've ever been in education, everybody basically had to rethink their entire educational model. Like, what happens when we can't go into the classroom? And higher education did that and adapted, and they have had a school year this year with, reasonable results. They also adapted very quickly when they made the decision to send people home. They didn't dally on that. And so if higher education retains the lesson it is learned during this pandemic, we might expect them to adapt to changes in the future, maybe adapt curriculum so that it's more what industry leaders need now, and just sort of generally react a little bit better than they did prior to this recession. And so that is the end of my presentation. And with that, I think we would be thrilled to take your questions.
Thanks, Brian. Some really interesting things you had there. I was especially interested in the type of people that are losing their jobs in higher ed and it being skewed toward those with lower wages. So Avery has sent some questions, a couple for me, and then Brian, maybe you can take a look at yours. So Kevin asked the question, does Chris subscribe to the popular belief that a lot of economists are forecasting that we will have a roaring 20s comparable to the 1920s roaring 20s? Why or why not? And of course, the other piece of the roaring 20s is that we had a pandemic just a year before the roaring 20s. And no, I do not subscribe to that. And here's why. Well, first of all, if the second half of this year and next year will be in some ways like the roaring 20s, the economy is going to be great. But then after that, after the stimulus kind of wears off, after the Fed starts increasing interest rates, there are two factors that tell us that this economy will be growing slower. So what is the potential rate of GDP? And I read a column for the Times-Dispatch, and I think I've written a column on this not too long ago. So Avery, if you remember that column, you could put it in the chat or a link of it in the chat. But so the two things that tell us how fast can this economy grow are labor force growth rate, how many people are coming into the economy, and productivity. So how fast can they produce things? The forecast labor force growth rate has been slowing over the past 2 decades because population growth and births have been slowing. And so when we looked over the next 10 years, the CBO Congressional Budget Office is predicting 0.4% growth in labor force. That's opposed to 1 or 2% when the baby boomers and women were coming into the workforce. So you take that labor force growth and you add it to productivity, and the sum of that tells us how fast the economy can grow. So productivity growth is hard to forecast, but productivity, most economists are looking for it to be around 1.1% or so. You add 1.1 to 0.4, and the fastest this economy can grow is less than 2%, 1.5% over the long run. If the economy is growing faster than 1.5%, the Fed will start to increase interest rates to slow the economy down. If it's growing slower than that, then they leave interest rates low to pick it back up. So the demographics were much different in the roaring 20s than they are today. And that's what's going to keep us from having a repeat of the roaring 20s. I think there was, hopefully that answered it. And if Avery, oh good, she found the article. Thank you. Second question from Summer, are you factoring in workforce available and training when determining your industry employment numbers? To some degree, because we are assuming participation rates pick back up. So right now the participation rate is low, is lower than it has been for some time because of several factors. Some individuals who are parents had to drop out of the labor force because their kids are at home and they have to help them through school. So we'll see that pick back up once kids get back to school. Some people are out of the workforce because they have concerns about getting the virus. So once they get vaccinated, that will pick back up. And then some people that are low paid or part-time workers get more to stay at home right now because the additional $600 in federal unemployment insurance on top of what the state pays. So they have an incentive not to go back in to work, although some of them are. And then Lisa, is the 80% herd immunity based on total population, or does it exclude younger people who do not spread the virus? It's based on total population, and we assume that the vaccination of those below 16 that are being tested right now will start to occur before we get to the next school year. Brian, did you have any you wanted to address?
Sure. Scott asked whether do we know how much of the higher ed job loss is retirement? We don't know specifically. Again, all of the data from this is sort of not as timely as we want it to be, so we're still figuring a lot of that stuff out. Anecdotally, I've heard a lot of stories of early retirements, of maybe what we might call forced retirements that have happened. But no, I don't know specifically how much of the job loss are retirements. The sense that I get is that not enough to change the dynamics of sort of people in their mid or early career getting whacked too. Rich asks, most of the higher education job cuts have come in support staff, administrative functions, and adjuncts. Aren't colleges putting the job loss burden disproportionately on the backs of these folks? Yes, 100%. These are their most vulnerable workers, and those are the ones who are suffering the most. So, yeah, I do think that colleges are disproportionately getting rid of these people. David, I don't have stats on the amount of time male or all faculty members lost for research each day. When the Chronicle displayed that 90 minutes of lost research time per day for female researchers, female faculty members, they were trying to illuminate the sort of the dynamic that we've heard a lot about how women in the workforce have been forced into more child rearing duties as a result of the recession and as a loss of, the ability to get help, or kids not going to school and having to stay home with them and things like that. So that was the dynamic they were trying to illustrate. How much of the $183 billion projected loss is offset by the new COVID's relief package? A good bit of it, as we talked about during the presentations. And won't some colleges actually end up in the plus column? I think some colleges might end up in the plus column when you just look at state and federal aid. That is, they may get more aid than they did in I guess this next year would be fiscal year 22. In fiscal year 22 than they did in fiscal year 2019, right? I think when you look at overall revenue, though, they'll still be down just because tuition revenue is such a huge part of the total revenue stream for colleges. And so nobody's going to be in a better financial position after all of this. But yes, some schools, it will absolutely, the financial situation for each college will be a little bit different depending on what happened to their enrollment, how much funding they got, and things like that. And I would encourage everyone to check in on sort of how their local institutions or how their alma maters are doing. And if you can scrape together a gift this year, it would be even more appreciated than normal because these are tough times.
Thanks, Brian. One question here that I also have is, can you also expand upon the retail jobs moving to transportation and warehousing? So whenever we go through recessions, we see some trends that had been previously happening accelerate. But then on the other hand, sometimes we think, as Brian has pointed out in his presentation as well, that those trends will continue, and that's not always the case. For example, in the last Great Recession, we saw that people were buying smaller homes. Some people thought, oh no, if I have a house that's more than 4,000 square feet, I'll never be able to sell it. And of course, as soon as we came out of the recession and people had more money, those types of houses were selling without any problem. But in terms of retail, so we've seen people purchasing things online and have them delivered to their house. So we're seeing more of a need for warehouses, more of a need for delivery, and to some degree, we'll see some of that go away when the recession ends. But the other thing, and this has been driven too in part by having wanting to make sure things are sanitized, Amazon has been talking about cashierless purchasing. And they have, there was a nice article in the Wall Street Journal just a couple of weeks ago saying that they have quietly been putting up these cashierless grocery stores at some big MSAs across the country. So clearly that's something that probably other retail establishments will also jump on the bandwagon there and go toward cashierless. So hopefully that gave you an answer to that. I also saw there was a question on FDI, foreign direct investment. Do we have any herd immunity information internationally? Unfortunately, we don't, but if we do run into something, we'll get that out to you for a link. What impact will that have on foreign direct investment, or what impact is COVID having? And I know that many of you economic developers, if we have some on the line, have been very creative in, although not going to Europe or to South America to talk to some companies that are considering expanding, having some Zoom meetings and presenting over Zoom, as well as showing some of the sites. Avery, do we have anything else?
Yes, we have one more question, and some people are having to go because it's past 1, but we do have one more question from Bill. He writes, how critical is the debt load on the national debt as a function of GDP? Is it dragging on the economy?
Right. So at this point, the debt is not a negative drive on the economy. However, at some point, we're all going to wake up and say, hey, we've got to bring that debt down and not leave it for future generations to pay. And if we don't bring it down quick enough, then investors are not going to invest in our bonds. Then interest rates will rise significantly, and that will have a detrimental effect on the economy. We've heard some talk about increasing taxes, and from a corporate perspective, we need to consider if we increase taxes on corporations and they're above where they are in other countries, some of those firms could easily move their headquarters outside the U.S., as we were seeing maybe several years ago. And so that would be a drag on the economy as well. And then increasing corporate taxes, reducing profitability, then you have corporations putting less money perhaps into investment, into new products, or into productivity enhancing equipment. And if productivity grows at a slower rate, then we'll see GDP growing at a slower rate as well. But the next year and a half should be really good. So I know we're seeing
Sounds good.
We're seeing people starting to drop off. Thank you again for spending time with us. And again, we're happy to continue these webinars, and let us know if there are particular topics you want us to cover. So please be safe, get your vaccine when you're able, and wear your mask, and go out and spend. Thank you.